Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had quite a few people ask me in the last couple days if I would jump into this situation where Vegan Gains and Jeff Nippard got into a disagreement about cholesterol. And so yeah, I think I'll go ahead and cover that, because let's turn this into a learning experience and let's try to be as objective as possible. Let's try to take out people's biases the best we can. This isn't going to be current events. This is going to be informative for the day. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, essentially my understanding of it, because I watched Vegan Gains' stuff, and I watched it about, gosh, probably 2 weeks ago. And I just left it alone, but people are asking about it. So if I understand it, it was essentially Jeff Nippard saying cholesterol, dietary cholesterol doesn't matter, not really that big of a deal, not really associated with health risk, and then Vegan Gains jumped all up in him and said, no, bro, it is. And there's plenty of data on it. Now, people are going to say, they obviously both have their own biases. Which one's right? Well, I mean, if we really want to look at the literature, the one that's closer to right is Vegan Gains. I'm not saying he's dead on. I think he takes a very dogmatic, and I think he takes an extreme approach to all this stuff, but veganism is an extreme philosophy. But, I mean, if we have to look at the overall weight of the scientific evidence, the truth is closer to his circle here. I mean, and people need to have a certain viewpoint of saying you can never say that any food in excess isn't going to carry risk to you, right? I mean, and that's the problem you're into. If someone says, this substance in your food is perfectly healthy, well, too much of anything will kill you, right? And I think we all understand that. Even water, there are dozens of documented cases of excessive water intake killing people. It's called water intoxication. And yes, it can kill you. Now, it takes a lot. And people would argue about things like saturated fat. We could argue about fructose. So, well, yeah, it takes a lot of those things to kill you. Well, we live in a world where it's easy to get a lot of those things. That's rather the point. Yeah, out in the wild, primitive man, for hundreds of thousands of years, sorry creationists, didn't have access to enough of either one of these substances to kill them, right? They didn't have access to enough saturated fat until you got to the Inuits. And then they do, and they all die young, and they're all fat. It seems to work. That's the only tribe of people you have who still live some sort of Paleolithic lifestyle, who are obese and die young. And they eat an unhealthy amount of saturated fat. I mean, what a coincidence. Which, again, hilarious. The keto-tards love to use them as an example when they're the shortest lived and most obese tribal people that we know of who still follow the traditional lifestyle. But here's what we have to look at. Let's discuss what's really going on. It's not the dietary cholesterol. And I know Vegan Gains is going to jump up, and that's a distinction we need to make. Yes, there's been a correlation with dietary cholesterol, but the data that I've seen over the years suggests it's the saturated fat content of these high cholesterol foods is the problem. Now, why does that matter? Why do we need to draw the distinction? Because there are zero cholesterol foods that are still high in saturated fat. But if we go conversely the other direction, there is no food that I'm aware of that's got a very significant amount of cholesterol in it that doesn't contain a significant amount of saturated fat. The two tend to go hand in hand in animal products, right? The more saturated fat you have in, and usually in an animal product, usually the higher the cholesterol is. And it doesn't seem to be the cholesterol that's the problem. Now, this is where Jeff Nippard can make it argue, well, the cholesterol itself, yeah, but every single food that contains cholesterol contains significant amounts of saturated fat. There is an enormous correlation between the two until you jump over to plant foods. But then you go to stuff like coconuts, and you have a lot of leading cardiologists who are saying, don't eat coconuts. It's going to kill you as fast as butter will. Based upon the saturated fat, and that's what we've noted. It's not the exact cholesterol intake that is the problem. It is the accompanying saturated fat intake. Saturated fat is directly correlated with elevated LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol has been determined by quite a few leading experts to be the causation of hardening of your arteries. And being on a ketogenic diet doesn't protect you from that. It still seems to occur. It's a long-term negative effect. So here's the problem with using the cholesterol in the food as your target number. Not everyone absorbs dietary cholesterol. Okay, that needs to be noted. Some people don't even really absorb it. It doesn't affect them at all. But the saturated fat is the concern here. And by that same token, that means vegans aren't off the hook either. If they jump up and say, well, you know, I don't eat animal products, I can't get any of these diseases, and then they're, you know, they're gorging on coconut oil, they're still following a high saturated fat diet. So their so-called heart-healthy vegan diet is going to still give them atherosclerosis. It's still going to kill them. It's just that we tend to think of saturated fat as coming from fatty animal sources, right? That's where we think of it coming from, because that's where most of it comes from. But there are definitely plants that we have started eating more and more in the modern world that are high in saturated fat, and you need to be aware of that. So what we're really talking about here is saturated fat intake, and it's a quantitative thing. And that's where we would disagree with someone like Vegan Gains. He'll say, well, you know, in excess it kills you, but I would argue that even in moderation it could still have harmful. Well, the data doesn't support that in moderation. That's rather the point. It's like saying we know that fructose in excess is bad for you, right? We know that. Saturated fat in excess is bad for you. Now, the point there, people say, well, I don't eat it in excess. Well, maybe you do. It's really easy in our modern world to get in excess of saturated fat. It's very easy, in fact, on a lot of just traditional normal foods. I mean, if you're eating bacon and eggs for breakfast every morning and you're putting butter on your toast, you might want to check your total saturated. That's a pretty high saturated fat meal, and that's how you're starting your day off. Then what else are you eating with it? What are you eating throughout the rest of the day? You'd be surprised how easy it is with our high fat diets that we have had for years now, that our high fat diets, of how easy it is to reach something like 30 grams of saturated fat in a day. And that's considered to be your risk. That's your danger zone. That's where most of the experts I've seen kind of say, well, there's your ballpark figure. You start hitting around 30 grams of saturated fat a day, you're putting yourself at risk of heart disease. Well, that's very easy to do with all these high fat foods that we have. Butter, bacon, eggs. And people say, well, I thought eggs were fine in moderation. Well, they probably are fine in moderation. No one's, but what we're talking about here is not the individual foods. We're talking about the cumulative effect of these things day after day over time. It's not just your eggs. It's your eggs plus your bacon plus your butter plus those 5 different hamburgers you eat for lunch every week. That stuff adds up. We're talking about a quantitative intake, right? It's not that this over here is automatically bad. Because again, if we go over to the same thing, we know fructose in excess is bad. We know that it is. Does that mean you can't eat several pieces of fruit a day? Of course not. If anything, it's been noted that people tend to live longer and have better health the more fruit they eat. Because if you're eating fruit that does have a little bit of fructose in it, there's definitely some fructose, obviously, in all fruit. That's where the term fructose comes from. That's where we kind of get this association. Fruit sugar is what you think of it as. Yes, there is a small amount of fructose in every single piece of fruit, but compared to a lot of other foods, it's still better for you. So that small amount of fructose, even if you end up with a moderate intake of fructose, but your only source of fructose is coming from fruit and you're eating 5 or 6 pieces of fruit a day, you're just not going to see health problems from that because it's a quantitative amount. You know, if anything, replacing some of the other stuff you're eating with fruit is going to be healthier. Again, being realistic, understanding quantitative, but when we start going to all these refined sugars that we have access to, and I don't care whether it's table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, honey, any of these things, right? These are all very, very high fructose, concentrated, calorically dense foods. You're likely to have problems. This should be an easy concept for people to grasp. Now we jump over to the other stuff. We have access to a lot of really fatty meats. And they're normal, regular parts of our diet. And then the fact that the butter and everything else, all these, again, very concentrated saturated fat. Butter is, what is it, something like 50% saturated fat or more by calorie. We're getting up here towards the amount of fructose and table sugar at this point, right? The stuff we're worried about in excess, when it starts reaching 50% of your caloric load of a food, that's a major problem, right? That's a major problem. It's very easy to rack that saturated fat number up real fast when you start adding bacon and butter to your food every day. You know, it adds up fast, and that's rather the point. It needs to be moderated. And when we look at this and say, okay, these things in moderation don't have the problems. Vegan Gains would disagree with that, and that's okay. That's his prerogative. But, you know, again, the bulk of the data suggests that moderating these things is sufficient. The problem we run into is that moderation versus what the average person views as moderating might not be the same. The average American, their view of moderation of saturated fat might still be a high saturated fat diet, right? It still might be a high saturated fat diet because they're eating more of it than they think. They might be eating 3 times the amount of saturated fat they think, even though they've moderated it a bit. You know, they're still eating the bacon and eggs for breakfast every morning. Well, I can tell you right now, you eat a significant quantity of bacon and eggs in the morning, it's real easy to hit a high saturated fat diet based on that alone, even if you ate low saturated fat the rest of the day. And you need to look at the fact that even in your lower fat meats, it's still there. It's still in chicken breast. It's just there's very, very little of it. Hell, it's in peanut butter. I love me some natural peanut butter. So what you're looking at is how much of it are you really eating on a daily basis? And when it starts becoming excessive, and that excessive might still be with what most people are thinking of as in moderation, well, then that's a problem. That is going to carry long-term health risks. And the situation we deal with, though, is that anytime you're experiencing weight loss and fat loss, these factors don't appear. And that's where some of it gets masked. I mean, so we can get into this argument of what can you get away with eating when you're on a fat loss diet and you're losing body fat in terms of lipid profiles versus what can you sustain long term. Yeah, these health markers don't appear when you're in a weight loss phase. In fact, eating either large amounts of fructose, large amounts of saturated fat, any of this stuff, when you are successfully losing body weight quickly, it doesn't show on your blood work. It doesn't seem to be a problem. But if you sustain eating those same amounts of those substances once you go to caloric maintenance and you stop losing weight, then your blood work, you start seeing those negatives, all right? They start to appear very quickly. And when you go to caloric surplus, when you're gaining weight, when you are gaining weight, even if it's a very slow weight gain, even a pound a month, and you're eating a lot of saturated fat, or you're eating a very large amount of fructose or any of those things, your blood work's going to look atrocious. And if you were to sustain that for the long term, yeah, you're going to be at risk of various diseases, cardiovascular disease, blood sugar related diseases. And the data is there, guys. The data is there. People need to understand we're not dealing with situations of good and bad foods. We are dealing with a situation of the quantity of intake of the individual things in these foods. And that is a concern. And it would be different if we lived in a different environment. But we live in an environment where we have access to abundance. And that access to abundance gives us access to the stuff that will kill us in excess. And it does kill us. We need to be honest about that. We need to be honest about that. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.